building for the German military was to create a series of deep underground industrial production plants, which Dorsch began to do, but of course the end of the war cut those plans short. He was taken into captivity by the American military and detained in one of their prisoner of war facilities. Now, while in American military captivity, he produced at least two documents during the course of his debriefing, which I have. There are others. There's at least one other I couldn't get, and I believe there must certainly be others that are classified to this day. Now, in this document that I have, the Project Paperclip memos, they ask specifically to bring Faber-Dorsch to the United States to work on the military's so-called underground plant program. I don't know if he came. I rather suspect he did, because most every German that Project Paperclip wanted, Project Paperclip got, and he was in American military custody. So I think it would have been pretty simple for them to bring him to the United States. He did have a civil engineering career in Germany after the war. However, he founded a firm in 1952, so there was a period of approximately 7 years where he would have been available to the Americans, and I rather suspect that he was consulting for them during that period.
Do you think any of these bases might be connected, Richard, in terms of tunnels with rail lines or anything like that?
Yeah, I do. I think that's very possible. In fact, there was another Nazi engineer. Well, I shouldn't say Nazi because I don't know if he was actually a card-carrying Nazi, but there was another German engineer who was working during the Third Reich by the name of Hermann Kemper, and he was working on a concept that he called the Rohrbahn. He carried out R&D on that during the 1930s and even during the 40s during World War II, and the research continued after World War II. And in fact, today the Germans are among the world leaders in magnetic levitation train technology, so-called maglev technology. And Hermann Kemper's Rohrbahn, even in the 1930s, was designed to go 1,800 miles per hour underground. That's 1,800 miles per hour underground, riding on a magnetic field and zooming through an underground tunnel from which most of the air has been evacuated, such that you have a partial vacuum. And thus you would have very little wind resistance and very little friction. And because the train would ride on a magnetic field, you wouldn't have friction from wheels and rails either. So it could indeed zip along very fast. So that was his scheme. That research has been continued down through the years after World War II. In about 1949, Robert Goddard, the father of American rocketry, and really of chemical rocketry in general, who, by the way, did some of his best work in Roswell, New Mexico during the 1930s. Anyway, Goddard had a patent in 1949 in which he had a design similar in many respects to that of Hermann Kemper. But Robert Goddard's train was designed to go coast to coast in North America in 10 minutes. In other words,
10 minutes? Wow.
Yes, at about 15,000 miles per hour underground. Now that work was also extended by an engineer named Robert Salter for the RAND Corporation. He produced a study for the RAND Corporation in the 1970s with a scheme very similar to that of Hermann Kemper and Robert Goddard. In Salter's scheme, you would have, again, a maglev train, very high-speed maglev train, going at speeds in the 14,000 and 15,000 mile per hour range. However, Salter, in Salter's scheme, there's provision made for intermediate stops mid-continent, so he would take as much as, say, 50 or 55 minutes to go coast to coast.
That's going to happen if it isn't.
Well, you
really
see, it may already have been done.
Yeah.
And I say that because starting about in the mid-'60s and continuing through the 70s and right down to the late 70s and maybe around 1980 or so, there was in this country something called the High-Speed Ground Transportation Initiative. This was a multi-agency R&D effort involving some military agencies from the Navy and Army, for example, but also from other government agencies such as the Department of Transportation. And then you had some of the railroads involved, major corporations like GE and Westinghouse, I believe, were involved. Then you also had some of the nation's premier engineering schools, mining engineering and also other engineering schools who were involved in the design, R&D of an underground, very high-speed tube train tunnel network. Now, this research was carried out actively over a period of years, and this multi-agency, approximately 15-year effort produced a pile of studies, articles, designs, memos, etc., many of which I have collected in the course of my research. And it all went away in about the early 1980s, late 70s, early 1980s. Not too long after that, we started hearing rumors about secret underground tunnel systems with high-speed trains zooming through them.
And we started hearing homes around this time.
Yeah, all of which caused me to think, that there probably are secret underground high-speed trains. There's certainly people who say that there are. I'm inclined to give them a hearing.
Let's talk for a moment, Richard, if we can, about some of the undersea bases, and then at the break we'll get into what could be extraterrestrial or alien bases and see if there's a working relationship here. Now, these undersea bases fascinate. Are these bases that you have to get to them via submarine, or is there another way to enter and get into them?
Well, my research shows that there would be at least 3 ways, and maybe more if there were exotic technologies involved. One of the most prosaic ways to enter an undersea base would be via a vertical shaft on an island, say like Bermuda or the Hawaiian Islands or something like that, and go down, say, a mile or 2 or 3 through a vertical shaft, and once at depth, go out under the sea through a more or less horizontal tunnel and access undersea bases that way. In theory and in practice, there's nothing to exclude such tunnels for extending for hundreds of miles, the more so if you have high-speed trains zooming through them. So that's one way. Another way is to actually extend tunnels out under the seabed from onshore. And again, here, the tunnels could even be hundreds of miles long. There's another way to do it, and that is to put airlocks right on the seafloor and to get access to an undersea base that way. All of these means of accessing undersea bases are openly discussed in the open literature that I've examined. Now, if you did have submarine access, it's state-of-the-art for the United States Navy, and I'm sure for other navies as well, to mate to hatches for airlocks in a deep-sea environment. So that certainly would be a way to transfer not only personnel, but supplies and equipment. I believe that's happening. The circumstantial evidence I have points in that direction, and I've had people tell me that there are undersea facilities. So at this point, I accept that they must exist.
Did you come across any research that shows that some of these undersea bases are either at the North Pole or the South Pole?
Yeah, and if you look at the illustrations in my book, there's some wonderful illustrations by a Navy illustrator who was attached to the Navy's R&D team at the China Lake Naval Ordnance Test Station in California back in the mid-1960s. His name is Walter Kirshner, and he in fact produced one illustration that depicts a submarine going through a subsea tunnel through a kind of a seamount, and that is clearly in a polar region because there's pack ice there on the surface of the sea. So clearly the Navy had asked him or tasked him with depicting graphically certain scenarios related to undersea submarine tunnels as well as undersea bases. So, yeah, I think they're there, and other places around the world as well, George. The picture that's come into focus for me is that we have been so massively lied to that we, the members of the public, don't really understand the full extent of the technology that's been developed with our money, without our knowledge, and to our great detriment. We are fighting ruinous wars right now over fossil fuel reserves in Asia. Meanwhile, technology is being held back from us that makes all of that superfluous. So the reason this is happening is just for war profiteering. End of discussion.
Did the Nazis, after the war, besides coming here under the paperclip operation, what they may be doing, I had always heard that Hitler escaped in a submarine and made his way under the Antarctic.
Yeah, I don't know if Hitler escaped or not. He may have. I couldn't say one way or the other. But it is true the Nazis had an interest in the Antarctic, and in fact they claimed part of the Antarctic territory for the Third Reich. So I would rule out that the Nazis may have had some kind of activities at the South Pole.
Richard, stay with us. We're going to come back and talk about what the ETs might have. We'll be back. Okay, next hour we'll open up the phone lines, give you an opportunity to talk with Richard Sauter about his really remarkable work with Hidden in Plain Sight beyond the X-Files. We'll be back with him, though. I want to talk about the possibility of these ET underground bases. That's next on Coast to Coast AM. Richard, what did your work uncover? I was going to say dig up, but as we talk about underground bases, maybe we shouldn't. What did your work uncover about ETs and the possibility of their bases?
Well, they certainly seem to be down there. There are a fair number of people who report being taken into underground facilities, and in some cases undersea facilities, where they interact with or see extraterrestrial or seeming alien beings. So I accept that they're down there. I might add that people also report being abducted by factions of the American military and taken underground into these facilities. So it's very bizarre, and these are criminal activities, by the way. If you are kidnapped, that used to be a capital crime. So I don't think it makes it all right for the military to stealthily abduct people. If you were to do that, you would be subject to incarceration in the penitentiary
Sure.
potentially for decades. So why is it okay if you have an American military uniform on to sneak around abducting people, and yet this is going on?
These ET bases, are they being done with our cooperation?
I think in some cases it looks like that's what's happening. And it raises a host of questions for which I don't have ready answers. But the questions themselves trouble me, and I believe they trouble many other people who think about these issues to an extent.
Now, are there craft also underground? Or
Yeah, I think so. And in fact, I have an illustration from Look magazine from 1955 in my book. There was an article that Look magazine came out with in 1955 pertaining to the many flying saucer sightings that were being had around the country. And people were talking about this. It was a real topic of conversation back then. You may remember that, George. I was a kid then, but I remember that a lot of UFOs were seen where I lived in the Tidewater region of Virginia.